let me also tell our viewers that the Pentagon is going to hold a news conference after President Trump has ordered the U.S. military strike on Syria. And on this discussion, I'm also joined in by our guest, Mr. Glenn Carl. Let me go across to Mr. Glenn Carl. And Mr. Carl, we are all waiting for this press conference in Pentagon to begin, and we could just dip into it any moment. But before that, Mr. Carl, you know, how do we see this scenario now changing? Because let's not forget that Syria is still battling with the Kurdish and the rebel forces. What sort of a role do you see the rebels and the Kurdish forces? Okay, I'm going to come to you. I'm going to come back to you. As I said, that the Pentagon press conference is about to begin, and it has just started. We'll come back to you after this press conference is over.
The Syrian people have suffered terribly under the prolonged brutality of the Assad regime. On April 7th, the regime decided to again defy the norms of civilized people, showing callous disregard for international law by using chemical weapons to murder women, children, and other innocents. We and our allies find these atrocities inexcusable. As our Commander-in-Chief, the President has the authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to use military force overseas to defend important United States national interests. The United States has vital national interests in averting a worsening catastrophe in Syria and specifically deterring the use and proliferation of chemical weapons. Last year, in response to a chemical weapons attack against civilians and to signal the regime to cease chemical weapons use, we targeted the military base from which the weapons were delivered. Earlier today, President Trump directed the U.S. military to conduct operations in consonance with our allies to destroy the Syrian regime's chemical weapons research, development, and production capability. Tonight, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States took decisive action to strike the Syrian chemical weapons infrastructure. Clearly, the Assad regime did not get the message. Another chemical weapons attack for which they will be held accountable. The 70 nations in the Defeat ISIS coalition remain committed to defeating ISIS in Syria. The strike tonight separately demonstrates international resolve to prevent chemical weapons from being used on anyone under any circumstance in contravention of international law. I want to emphasize that these strikes are directed at the Syrian regime. In conducting these strikes, we have gone to great lengths to avoid civilian and foreign casualties. But it is a time for all civilized nations to urgently unite in ending the Syrian civil war by supporting the United Nations-backed Geneva peace process. In accordance with the Chemical Weapons Convention prohibiting the use of such weapons, we urge responsible nations to condemn the Assad regime and to join us in our firm resolve to prevent chemical weapons from being used again. General Dunford will provide a military update.
Hey, good evening. I'm joined by our French attaché, Brigadier General Montague, and our British attaché, Air Vice Marshal Gavin Parker. Secretary Mattis has just outlined the policy and legal framework for tonight's strike in Syria. I'll address the strike from the military dimension. At 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, French, British, and U.S. forces struck targets in Syria in support of President Trump's objective to deter the future use of chemical weapons. Our forces were integrated throughout the planning and execution of the operation. The targets that were struck and destroyed were specifically associated with the Syrian regime's chemical weapons program. We also selected targets that would minimize the risk to innocent civilians. The first target was a scientific research center located in the greater Damascus area. This military facility was a Syrian center for the research, development, production, and testing of chemical and biological warfare technology. The second target was a chemical weapons storage facility west of Homs. We assessed that this was the primary location of Syrian sarin and precursor production equipment. The third target, which was in the vicinity of the second target, contained both a chemical weapons equipment storage facility and an important command post. U.S., British, and French naval and air forces were involved in the operation, and for reasons of operational security, I won't be more specific this evening. Before we take questions, I'd like to address how this evening's strike were qualitatively and quantitatively different than 2017. Last year, we conducted a unilateral strike on a single site. The focus was on the aircraft associated with the Syrian chemical weapons attack in April of 2017. This evening, we conducted strikes with two allies on multiple sites that will result in a long-term degradation of Syria's capability to research, develop, and employ chemical and biological weapons. Important infrastructure was destroyed, which will result in a setback for the Syrian regime. They will lose years of research and development data, specialized equipment, and expensive chemical weapons precursors. The strike was not only a strong message to the regime that their actions were inexcusable, but it also inflicted maximum damage without unnecessary risk to innocent civilians. And with that, the Secretary and I would be glad to take your questions.
Mr. Secretary, first of all, did the U.S. suffer any losses initially? And more broadly, could you, the President in his remarks said that the U.S. and its allies are prepared to sustain this operation until the Syrians stop using chemical weapons. Does this mean that the U.S. and its partners will continue military operations beyond this initial operation tonight?
That will depend on Mr. Assad should he decide to use more chemical weapons in the future. And of course, the powers that have signed the chemical weapons prohibition have every reason to challenge Assad should he choose to violate that. But right now, this is a one-time shot, and I believe that it sent a very strong message to dissuade him, to deter him from doing this again.
Any U.S. losses?
We'll brief on that in the morning. We want to give you a full brief in the morning. Right now, we have no reports of losses.
Thank you.
Secretary Mattis, Chairman Dunford, thank you for doing that. Have you seen any retaliation from the Russians or the Iranians? And how long do you think this operation could last? Is it a matter of hours or days, or could go longer than that?
Yeah, we did have some initial surface-to-air missile activity from the Syrian regime. That's the only retaliatory action that we're aware of at this time. And the nature of the operation, we've completed the targets that were assigned to the United States Central Command. Those operations are complete.
General Dunford and also Secretary Mattis, could you talk a little bit more about your concerns that you've expressed earlier in the week about Russian escalation? General Dunford, were you able to talk to your Russian counterpart, General Gerasimov? What are your concerns about escalation? And if we're permitted to ask your British counterpart a question, I would like to know the sense of your government about whether the situation with the Skripals and the Russian involvement in that, how that Russian involvement played a role in your decision to enter this coalition this evening.
Barbara, let me address the last point first. Our attachés were kind enough to join us this evening. They're not going to get out in front of their president and prime minister, respectively, so that the national messages will be provided from their capitals here very soon. But with regard to the Russian concerns, we specifically identified these targets to mitigate the risk of Russian forces being involved, and we used our normal deconfliction channels. Those were active this week to work through the airspace issues and so forth. We did not do any coordination with the Russians on the strikes, nor did we pre-notify them.
Mr. Secretary, it was just a couple of days ago that you said you're still assessing the intelligence on the chemical weapons attack, suspected attack. So at this point, do you know what the chemical was used in that attack? Was it sarin? Was it chlorine? And also, what is your evidence it was actually delivered by the Syrian regime?
Say the last part again, Tom.
What's your evidence it was delivered by the Syrian regime? Are you quite clear it was?
I am confident the Syrian regime conducted a chemical attack on innocent people in this last week. Yes, absolutely confident of it. and we have the intelligence level of confidence that we needed to conduct the attack.
As far as the actual chemical used, do you know what it was? Was it nerve agent? Was it chlorine? Do you have a sense of what it was?
We are very much aware of one of the agents. There may have been more than one agent used. We are not clear on that yet. We know at least one chemical agent was used.
I just want to clarify on the deconfliction line. You notified the Russians ahead of time before the operation began what you were going to do and what targets you were going to strike?
Gordon, to be clear, the only communications that took place specifically associated with this operation before the targets were struck was the normal deconfliction of the airspace, the procedures that are in place for all of our operations in Syria.
General Dunford, you mentioned that the the Syrian air defenses had engaged. The Syrian state TV is saying they shot down 13 Tomahawk missiles. Can you refute that?
Jennifer, I can't tell you the results. We literally, as you know, the time on target was about an hour ago, and we came straight up here to give you the best information we have right now. Tomorrow morning, as the Secretary will talk about in a minute, we'll give you the more detailed operational update and some of the details, but those details aren't available to us right now.
This wave of airstrikes is over.
This wave of airstrikes is over. That's why we're out here speaking to you now.
Secretary Mattis, I just wanted to follow up on what you said about the legal basis for this strike. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because in your testimony the other day, it sounded like you were saying that this a potential strike would somehow be linked to self-defense and the presence of American forces in Syria. Can you say a little bit more about that? And also, regarding whether or not there will be future action or additional strikes, you said that it would depend on whether or not the Assad government conducts future chemical attacks, but can you explain a little bit more about what would be the threshold for that? Because there were repeated chemical attacks between the April 2017 attack and today, and would you consider a small-scale chlorine attack sufficient to launch additional strikes?
Right now, I will just tell you we're in close consultation with our allies. We review all the evidence all the time. It is difficult, as you know, to get evidence out of Syria, but right now we have no additional attacks planned. But as far as the legal authority under the Article 2 of the Constitution, we believe the President has every reason to defend vital American interests, and that is what he did here tonight under that authority.
Hey, sir, a couple questions for General Dunford. What were some of the targeting considerations or difficulties involved with going after chemical facilities? How long did the operation take to plan? And for Secretary Mattis, last year's strikes were described as proportional, moderate. How would you describe this year's in contrast to that?
Yeah, Tony, we chose these particular targets to mitigate the risk of civilian casualties, number one. We chose these targets because they were specifically associated with the chemical program, the Syrian chemical program. And obviously, when we take a look at target planning and so forth, we look at the location relative to other populated areas, collateral damage, proportionality. So these targets were carefully selected with proportionality, discrimination, and being specifically associated with the chemical program.
All standoff weapons or any manned aircraft?
There were manned aircraft involved. I won't give you any of the details operational until tomorrow morning, but we will do that at that time.
Sir, instead of proportional last year,
a question to Secretary Mattis. So up until yesterday, and I'm going to quote you here, you said, "I cannot tell you that we have evidence." So when did you become confident that a chemical attack happened? And the second one,
yesterday.
Yesterday, after you said that.
Yes.
And then second, you talked about targeting the chemical weapons infrastructure of al-Assad. If there were actually any chemical weapons or agents in those facilities that you targeted, I assume they would create health hazard in the region or not?
Yeah, we don't believe. We did very close analysis. As the chairman pointed out, we did everything we could in our intelligence assessment and our planning to minimize to the maximum degree possible any chance of civilian casualties. We are very much aware this is difficult to do in a situation like this, especially when the poison gas that Assad assured the world he had gotten rid of obviously still exists. So it is a challenging problem set, and we had the right military officers dealing with it.
So you can confirm there's going to be no leak into the air? Or
of course not. We'll do our best.
When the surface-to-air defenses engaged, did they become a target, and did U.S. air power or other assets take out those targets?
Yeah, Tora, I'm not aware of any response that we took right now. Again, we'll gather overnight. As you can imagine, we tried to leave United States Central Command alone here tonight. They were quite busy. We'll, through the night, gather the operational detail, and we'll be back tomorrow morning to provide that to you.
Yeah, Secretary Mattis or Chairman Dunford, last year, you changed the force protection levels for the Syrian troops, that were U.S. troops that were in Syria. There are 2,000 U.S. troops in Syria. Have you changed force protection levels based on potential responses from Russia?
Yeah, Hans, as you can imagine, the commander always takes prudent measures, especially in an environment that we're in tonight. So they did make adjustments.
Just to be clear on the deconfliction line, you told them that you're going to be operating in airspace, but you didn't tell the Russians what the targets were?
That is absolutely correct. We used the normal deconfliction channels to deconflict the airspace that we were using. We did not coordinate targets or any planning with the Russians.
What was their response, sir?
That information was passed at the operational link from the Combined Air Operations Center in Qatar, so I wasn't on the line. But that kind of information, just to put it in perspective, is passed routinely every day and every night. So they may not have found anything unusual about that particular airspace deconfliction.
Thank you so much, Katrina Manson from the Financial Times. Can you talk a little bit about any Iran targets that you initially, Iran-associated targets that you initially considered, and why you may have not gone for them? And could your colleagues explain exactly the sort of contribution that you've made to tonight's operation?
Yeah, again, our allied officers are here out of respect for the fact that they were part of the mission from planning all the way through to the political decision taken. And once their heads of state speak tomorrow, then that'll be the initial statement from those capitals. But as far as any other targets, we looked at targets specifically designed to address the chemical weapons threat that we have seen manifested. The whole world has watched in horror these weapons being used. Those were the only targets that we were examining for prosecution.
Mr. Secretary and General Dunford, you mentioned 3 target areas that were struck. How can you be sure that from now on these are all of the target areas or all of the involved production facilities for chemical weapons that the Syrians are using? And do you believe that there are additional locations where they are producing such materials?
This is a great question. We had a number of targets to select from, and again, we did not select those that had a high risk of collateral damage and specifically a high risk of civilian casualties. And so the weaponeering, back to the earlier question, the weaponeering was done, the modeling was done to make sure that we mitigated the risk of any chemicals that were in those facilities and mitigate the risk of civilian casualties. So were there other targets that we looked at? There were. We selected these specific targets both based on the significance to the chemical weapons program as well as the location and the layout.
Thanks. Secretary Mattis, it seems like this strike tonight was pretty limited, not too dissimilar from last year. I know it was three targets this time instead of 1, but it still seems a little bit more targeted and more specific than what I think a lot of people were expecting. Can you walk us through your decision to, did concern about escalation with Russia affect your decision to keep this more targeted? And moving from there, how much assurance can you give us that this is going to do what the strike last year didn't do, which is basically to stop President Assad from using chemical weapons again?
Nothing is certain in these kinds of matters. However, we used a little over double the number of weapons this year than we used last year. It was done on targets that we believed were selective to hurt the chemical weapons program. We confined it to the chemical weapons type targets. We were not out to expand this. We were very precise and proportionate, but at the same time, it was a heavy strike.
Mr. Secretary, prior to the attack, how important was it to get the support from the allies, not only from an intelligence point of view, but also just from the countries themselves?
It's always important that we act internationally in a unified way over something, especially that is such an atrocity as this, that we've observed going on in Syria. But I would also tell you that these allies, the Americans, the French, the British, we have operated together through thick and thin, through good times and bad. And this is a very, very well integrated team. Wherever we operate, we do so with complete trust in each other, the professionalism, but more than that, the belief that one another will be there when the chips are down. So it's important, and it's a statement about the level of trust between our nations.
Could you just let us know whether the Syrians were able to hide a lot of these chemical weapons in the last several days, since there's been so much talk about a possible strike? Did that give the Syrians time to kind of move some of these weapons off limits? And then Secretary Mattis, just to confirm earlier when you were saying you had information about one of the chemicals, but we're all assuming that means chlorine, that you had information confirming chlorine, but not necessarily sarin. If you could just clarify that part.
Yeah, Phil, the first question, I'm not aware of any specific actions that the Syrians took to move chemical weapons in the last couple of days.
Yeah, we're very confident that chlorine was used. We are not ruling out sarin right now. Yeah.
General, I'd like to follow up on Lewis's question about targets that you first examined and then triaged down to the 3 tonight. It sounds like you went after facilities and not the actual weapons, as indicated earlier, to minimize accidental risk to civilians. In the targets that remain, could you characterize perhaps the ability for Syria to ramp up again and again have chemical weapons?
Yeah, I think it's too early to make that assessment. It's too early to make that assessment right now.
Thank you. General Dunford, did any Russian defenses engage U.S., British, or French ships or missiles? And Secretary Mattis, were any of the strikes tonight intended to kill Bashar al-Assad?
The only reaction that I'm aware of at this time was Syrian surface-to-air missiles. I happen to be down in the National Military Command Center and was aware of that activity. I'm not aware of any Russian activity, and I'm not aware of the full scope of the Syrian regime response at this time. Again, those will be details we'll pull together for you in the morning.
Yeah, the targets tonight, again, were specifically designed to degrade the Syrian war machine's ability to create chemical weapons and to set that back right now. There were no attempts to broaden or expand that target set. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming in this evening. Based on recent experience, we fully expect a significant disinformation campaign over the coming days by those who have aligned themselves with the Assad regime. And in an effort to maintain transparency and accuracy, my Assistant for Public Affairs, Ms. Dana White, and Lieutenant General McKenzie, the Director of the Joint Staff here in Washington, will provide a brief of known details tomorrow morning. We anticipate about 9 o'clock in this same location. But thank you again for coming in this evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, we are now joined in by our WION correspondent Nina Maria Potts, who's joining us live from Washington, D.C. Nina, we just heard the entire press conference that was conducted by General Joseph Dunford and Secretary James Mattis. You know, one thing which has been very clearly established by both of them at the press conference is that this retaliation or the strike in Syria has been specifically targeted for the chemical attack which was carried on in Syria, and that they are targeting only the chemical weapon infrastructure back there in Syria. And they also established the fact that this is not to target any sort of regime change in Syria.
That's correct. I mean, we heard very scant detail on the operational side of the strikes. We did hear that by comparison with last year, when similar strikes were conducted, those strikes last year were targeting one specific site. This evening's strikes have been targeting multiple targets and chemical weapons site with the sole objective, as we heard there from the U.S. Secretary of Defense General Mattis, of taking down the Syrian regime's war machine and its ability to develop chemical weapons. But again, repeatedly, we heard that there was no intention to strike Bashar al-Assad, that this was not the goal of the operation, that the three allies, the US, the UK and France, have a well-integrated coordination team, and that they did not consult the Russians at all. The Russians were not aware of this evening's strikes, and they did not coordinate at all with Moscow.
Right. Dunford also said that, the US has chosen to, target Syria and has avoided, any talk with regards to, say, Russia or Russia's response or any activity, with regards to the Russian response. Why that kind of, we could sense that they were trying to play very safe when it came to information with regards to a Syrian response. Why so?
Well, it's extremely sensitive. Clearly, there's a huge gulf between what Russia believes to be the case and what the US, the UK and France believe to be the case. And we've been seeing that fight play out at the United Nations all week, where any sense of unity was very elusive indeed. I don't think that the US sees the Russians as on their side on this particular question of Syria. President Trump's own intentions were very difficult to decipher, even as late as yesterday when he was tweeting that missiles could happen very soon or they might not happen at all. So even close observers and most probably his closest advisors within the National Security Council were not completely united on what action they should take, and probably till quite late in the game. I think that there was a huge sense of outrage and momentum coming from the Europeans, especially the United Kingdom and France, especially the French President Macron, who leaned on pressured US President Trump, I think, in several phone calls and a lot of diplomacy this week to extract from the Americans the commitment to take out these chemical weapons site amid a real deep sense of outrage in Europe over what went on last Saturday.
Right.
And the US generals here tonight very keen to stress that they had done everything that they could to avoid civilian casualties.
Right. Nina, I'll come back to you. I'm also joined in by our guest, Mr. Glenn Carl. Let me quickly go across to Mr. Carl. Mr. Carl, all right, I think we will try to reconnect with Mr. Glenn Carl. For now, let's go across to our Middle East Bureau Chief, Daniele Pagani. Daniele, we just heard the press conference. As I said, that, it's been clearly established that these airstrikes are targeted at the chemical weapon storage facilities based in Syria. We know that now we know that three establishments were targeted, one in Damascus, one in Homs, and there was another chemicals facility which was targeted. Do you think that, this is just the beginning of a series of airstrikes? Or is the operation actually over as what has been established currently at the press conference?
Just an update for the benefit of our viewers. What we know as of now is that there are no more strikes ongoing. So as of now, the contingent military operation conducted by the United States forces, the UK forces and the French forces is over as of now. To answer to your question, it's very difficult. I think that General Mattis said very clearly that this is a one-time, very targeted shot which aimed at the heart of the research and the stocking warehouses of potential chemical weapons. It remains to be seen whether the warehouses he was talking about were actually full with chemical weapons, because that would amount at a very, very severe violation of the international law. Remember that Syria was demanded to dismantle its entire arsenal and to stop producing it, and they agreed to that. And they have kept reiterating that they had no presence of any chemical weapon on Syrian soil. So that is an important information which we'll need to understand. We have no reason whatsoever to think that this will be the first of a wave of airstrike. At least this is what we can say if we go by the words of the Defense Secretary of the United States, General Mattis. Right.
Daniele, also, how do you see a response? Like, what sort of a response do you see coming in from, say, Syria or Russia, considering that, Secretary Mattis and General Dunford both established that so far they are not aware of any response coming in from Syria's air defense or of any Russian activity?
They will have to evaluate very, very carefully what kind of response they will carry on. Remember that this has been an attack which I would say it has been politically clever, so to say, in the sense that the choice of the target is the choice of a target which is not violating international law. We will need to understand the consequences of this target. General Mattis was very clear. He says they are trying their best to avoid civilian casualties, but when you bomb a chemical weapon warehouse, maybe gases and chemical agents could spread all over a certain area. This is, again, very early to say. It will be very difficult for Russia to retaliate, for instance, because there is no attack directed against Russian forces. There was no attack precisely targeting Russian military, Russian premises.
All right, Daniele, I'll quickly go across to Nina also, who's joining us live from Washington. Nina, one thing that this press conference has successfully established is the fact that, there was use of chemicals like chlorine during the chemical attack in Syria. And that Secretary Mattis also hinted that there could have been use of sarin also.
Well, that's right. As I understand it from what he was saying in that press conference, that they have evidence that one chemical agent was used, but they wouldn't go into detail on how many other chemical agents were used. Of course, it's a big bone of contention between the US and the Russians claiming that airstrikes would destroy evidence of any such attack. There was also speculation that ahead of chemical weapons inspectors going into Syria, that airstrikes would not be conducted because it would compromise that mission to investigate. So this move by the three allies, the US, the UK and France, is going to prove very controversial. I think in terms of your earlier question as to how the Syrian government, the Syrian regime will respond and how Russia will respond, I think we can expect a certain degree of intense anger that the three allies have just gone it alone.
Right. Nina, interestingly, Secretary Mattis also mentioned that, there was a confirmation on the chemical use that they received just yesterday. So that also goes on to, it also goes on to throw light on how rapidly the entire modus operandi actually took place.
Well, I think the level of coordination and discussion has been ongoing between these three countries' militaries for some time. We heard there from General Mattis that the point about that sort of level of coordination is that it sends a very strong signal that these three traditional allies are very much moving in sync and in harmony, and that this is proof that the relationship is tightly coordinated and runs very deep. So this isn't just about the decision on a united front to conduct strikes against Syria and to try and dismantle their ability to make chemical weapons. This is saying something a little bit more significant than that, which is that this is a Western alliance and this is a transatlantic alliance. And if anyone questioned the strength of that alliance, I think the message that Washington is trying to convey is that they would have been wrong.
Right. And Nina, let me also break this to our viewers. As we speak, you know, there are reports coming in that the Russian ambassador to US has responded on the Syria strike. He has said that the worst apprehensions have come true. We warn that such actions will not be left without consequences. The US, the possessor of the biggest arsenal of chemical weapons, has no moral right to blame other countries. So clearly, you know, that's the response we're getting from Russia, that this airstrike will be retaliated.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it comes against the backdrop of other tensions which haven't helped. I mean, just recently we've had the poisoning of a Russian spy on UK soil. I think that has fueled certainly Number 10's anger about Russia's behavior, which it deems aggressive and having gone a step too far. The poisoning of this Russian double agent could have happened on UK soil, I think, has unleashed a real sense of public outrage as well as anger at the upper echelons of the British government.
Absolutely.
I think Russia's
Nina,
response speaks.
I'm sorry to have interjected you right now, but since you brought up, you know, the nerve agent attack on the you know, the spy, ex-Russian spy Sergei Skripal, you know, I'm going to bring in that angle also. How much of a role do you think this entire episode has had to play on this current airstrike in Syria? Nina, I would like to ask you again that, you know, how much of a role do you think this nerve agent attack on ex-Russian spy Sergei Skripal has had to play in this current Syria airstrike?
Well, I mean, I think on a diplomatic level, it's had a huge impact on the state of UK-Russian relations. I think President Trump, who has not been known to take a hostile sort of stance against President Putin personally, President Trump himself is facing scrutiny for his personal warmth, apparent warmth towards President Putin, certainly in the run-up to the campaign, amid accusations of Russian meddling in the US election to come down on behalf of President Trump, or at least in President Trump's favor. So I think observers didn't expect President Trump to take a very hard line on Russia over the spy poisoning and that particular attack. But I think the UK pushed very hard for Washington to take a stance and to take a position. And it certainly did, and President Trump himself pointed the finger of blame at Russia. I think what's important to remember is that in the past, and certainly under the Obama administration, even then when relations were not good between the US and Russia, there was still avenues for cooperation. But we've returned now to a situation not dissimilar from the Cold War, and I think those traditional avenues of communication have simply broken down, and there's a great deal of concern that we are at an impasse.
Absolutely agree with you. You know that the situation currently is very, very similar and has strong parallels with, you know, the Cold War situation. Coming to Russia's response, do you think that Israel, Turkey and Saudi Arabia are not going to be left far behind?
Well, it depends on which perspective you're speaking. I mean, I think there's a great deal of finger pointing. President Trump has identified Russia and Iran as hostile nations. Washington's relationship with Saudi Arabia perhaps is a little bit more nuanced and complicated. At the moment, the focus here in Washington is very much on Russia and Iran. And of course, we're separately facing a May 12th deadline, which is likely to involve, according to commentators and analysts and those very familiar with that particular region, the speculation is building that President Trump is going to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal. which again will set off a sequence of events that nobody here knows quite, where that will go. So the atmosphere in Washington is feeling a little precarious, it has to be said. During the course of President Trump's first year in office, he has often come to the edge of the apparent abyss with his rhetoric. He seemed to ramp it up and then take a step back. I think what is perhaps alarming some quarters is that he has shown that he's prepared to take action, and that his rhetoric isn't just rhetoric, but he is prepared to put his money where his mouth is.
Right, right. Also, Nina, how do you see, President Donald Trump's cabinet playing a role now in the current political scenario, with a major reshuffle having taken place, with most of them having very hawkish stances? How do you see the political scenario shaping up now?
I mean, narrowly, in terms of the cabinet here and President Trump's own personal advisors, his presidency and his first year in office has been plagued by upheaval. We are facing the prospect of James Comey's book coming out on Tuesday. He's about to give a big television interview on his assessment of President Trump personally and professionally. That comes on the back of another very controversial book, Fire and Fury, in which there were certain revelations made there. The atmosphere in the West Wing and in the White House is known to be one that is not a happy ship, because President Trump has executed some decisions that not everyone has agreed with, and there is not the sense perhaps that one would expect of calm with President Trump taking an increasingly autonomous line in his decision-making. And it wasn't long ago that he was at odds with his own generals, and we saw his generals just briefed now at the Pentagon over Syria. President Trump himself declaring his intention to completely pull out of Syria, and yet here we are 2 weeks later with the news of airstrikes, and his generals speaking very much from the same hymn sheet.
Right, right. Nina, I'll also go across to Danile right now, who's also joining us live from Amman. Danile, we just heard Nina speak extensively about, the scenario back there in the White House and with President Donald Trump's cabinet. Let's shift focus over to West Asia now. What kind of responses do you see coming in from, say, Iran and Russia?
Certainly, Iran is going to be very angry diplomatically, trying to convince whoever possible to retaliate. But they hold no big leverage, if I have to say. Iran is the staunchest, perhaps, ally of President Bashar al-Assad. But from the military perspective, the only thing they can do in Syria right now is to ask the several militias they control to attack the U.S. troops, which are numbered in nearly 2,000 and are currently in the northern part of Syria and the Kurdish-controlled area. But this would be an extensive ground military campaign, which is very unlikely to happen. When it comes to Russia, it would be also very difficult to Russia. The words of the ambassador were pretty clear. There was no use of military vocabulary. He said there will be retaliation, but it's also going to be very difficult for Russia to understand. The American troops, the American Air Force or the Navy, will still yet to understand precisely from where the attack came from, did not target any Russian premise in Syria. So on the basis of what Russia would directly attack the United States, it remains to be seen. It could be absolutely unlawful. The fact that you attack an ally that has been an ally on a particular scenario does not mean that you're entitled to counterattack an attack against this ally without consequences. Remember that Russia attacking U.S. military premises would definitely escalate the situation to, I would say...
Absolutely. And Daniele, I'm sorry to have interrupted you right now, as we are just getting in fresh reports of the Russian ambassador to U.S. He has reacted on the Syria strike, and his latest statement says that insulting Putin is unacceptable. And, earlier we just read out to our viewers that he had also said that the worst apprehensions have come true. We warn that such actions will not be left without consequences. So clearly, that's a very, very angry response coming in from Russia.
very angry response, but also very meaningless. What does it mean? We don't know. There is no precise indication. Of course, Russia was demanded to say something. The Russian ambassador to the U.S., of course, was called and had to say something. And obviously, this is what he would have said. This is a very standard question that we would have all expected coming from the Russian embassy from the United States. We will see in the coming hours what kind of retaliation. I personally think that retaliating militarily, directly against the United States of America in West Asia, targeting either their temporary bases in Syria or perhaps in other countries like Iraq, is not an option for Russia.
Right. Also, Syria. We've received Syria's statement. It's saying that, the joint attack has been a flagrant violation, doomed to fail. So clearly they have dismissed this entire military positioning of U.S. in Syria. And how do you analyze Syria's stance at the moment?
Syria's stance at the moment, again, is a very much expected regular stance, and Syria will have even more problems than Russia in understanding how to retaliate directly against the United States forces, eventually also against France and the UK. The military strength, I am talking about the ground force of Syria, is in a very bad shape. It is believed to be at least 1/5 of the original strength. So, as you can imagine, it's very much unlikely they will launch a ground offensive. When also it comes to an air battle, that seems even more unlikely, because hadn't it been for the Russian air support, the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, would not have turned the tide of war. So I see Syria in a great difficulty to respond militarily as of now. I would even say nearly impossible for them to do so.
Daniele, I'm also joined in by Glenn Carl, former intelligence officer, who's joining us live from Boston. Let me quickly go across to Mr. Carl. Mr. Carl, we were just analyzing Syria and Russia's response, which, Daniele had to say is a very standard response coming in. So do you think it's a very wait-and-watch scenario at the moment?
Well, I agree with Daniele completely, actually. I think the situation is clarifying a little bit. The U.S. and France and Great Britain have made as clear as possible that the attacks are only against Syria's chemical facilities. So the Russians and the Syrians and the Iranians are all intelligent governments, and they know that, frankly, Assad has largely won the war thanks to the Russians. And if they don't strike at the United States, then their victory and Assad's regime will continue. And they have no hope of challenging the United States in a direct military confrontation. So if they are wise, they will say something that states their principle, their opposition to American, British, and French actions. They'll talk about sovereignty, they'll talk about international law, and they will do nothing. And then fundamentally their interests will be guaranteed, and the Western coalition will have made its point about chemical weapons. And if Syria is smart going forward, they can continue to advance their interests and their power without resorting to chemical weapons, and then their circumstances will improve.
Right. Mr. Carl, also, do you think this operation is actually over as has been announced at the press conference in Washington?
Well, I don't know. I was a little surprised to hear that, because Trump has made such noise about the need to strike more than the single attack from a year ago about now. But if the Syrians, Russians, and Iranians do not respond, and if the Syrians don't use chemical weapons quickly, then I think it's quite possible that the point will have been made. The U.S. can say, look, we struck multiple sites instead of just one. This was an international coalition acting in concert, and Syria won't dare to do this again. So it's quite possible that what the general said is what the U.S. intends. Right.
I am also joined in by our foreign correspondent, Mr. Ramesh Ramachandran from the newsroom. Ramesh, we just heard Mr. Carl, he said that this could be the end of an operation if Syria and Russia choose not to respond. How do you react to that?
Good morning, Akanksha. It's getting to 8:30 a.m. India time or 300 GMT. The news at the moment is that depending on what Russia chooses to do going forward, things might begin to get out of hand or begin to unravel. As of now, Russia has not retaliated just yet, but we can expect some kind of retaliation from Russia or its allies in the region, including Syria, Iran, and other allies in the region, to the latest provocation from Washington and its allies, namely the UK and France. But as of now, James Mattis telling reporters in Washington that this is a one-stop event. American forces will not be indefinitely present inside Syria, and that this is a message to Assad, whom he described as a criminal and somebody as a murderer, and his lieutenants to not use chemical weapons anymore going forward. So this is a one-time event intended to send a message across to Assad and his supporters that thus far and no further, and the US will not take it lying down.
Right, right. Also, Ramesh, why don't you elaborate for us what would we make out from this press conference that was conducted by US Defense Secretary James Mattis and U.S. Joint Chief of Staff, Mr. Joseph Dunford. What do you make of that? Because, you know, one thing was very aptly made clear, you know, that the retaliation is for the chemical attack that was organized there, and that, U.S. has vital interest in avoiding and seizing the chemical use, which is why they have specifically targeted the chemical weapons storage facilities in Syria.
Indeed, Akanksha, so this is what we know so far. In the last several hours, we've heard from all the dramatis personae in this unfolding story. We've heard from Washington, we've heard from France, we've heard from the UK, we've also heard from the Russian side. So let me put it all together for our viewers. Now, essentially what the US is saying that it's conducting, in coordination with France and the UK, targeted precision strikes targeting Damascus, and there are 3 areas in Damascus targeting a chemical factory, in Homs, a research center in the heart of Damascus, and 1 other location. There are 3 areas targeted, and the Syrian state media say that they have shot down 13 missiles fired targeting Damascus in the last several hours. So this is what is happening on the ground as we speak. But as far as statements go, we've heard from the White House in particular, Akanksha. It says Syria used chemical weapons on the 7th of April at Duma, and this is in retaliation to that incident on the 7th of April. And the White House clearly says that there have been evidence with the American side that Syrian forces used chlorine and in one incident, the nerve agent sarin. Also, we've heard from, remember yesterday we heard Nikki Haley, the US ambassador to UN, say that the Syrian forces used chemical weapons at least 50 times since 2011. So that's as far as the US side goes, the White House statement. Listening to the Russian ambassador to the US, Anatoly Antonov, who said that this is their worst apprehensions come true and that our warnings were left unheard. The responsibility for this rests entirely with the UK, US and France, and that this is a pre-designed scenario being implemented by the US and its allies, and that the Russian side fears that the US, which has the largest chemical weapons arsenal, has no moral right to blame any other country, leave alone Syria. Now, going forward, we also heard from Syria, and Syrian forces say that they've shot down 13 missiles, as I said, at the Al-Kiswa on the outskirts of Damascus, the capital. In the meantime, we've heard from the presidency of Syria and the office saying that, quote-unquote, good souls will not be humiliated. This is the news coming in from Damascus, from the presidency of Bashar al-Assad. And James Mattis saying that this is a one-time shot, and we've used double the number of munitions used in last year's attack in April at the Shayrat air base inside Syria, and that this, as I said, is a message to Assad and his quote-unquote murderous lieutenants to not use chemical weapons ever again. Akanksha?
Right. Ramesh, let me also bring in Glenn Carl, who's joining us live from Boston. Mr. Carl, we just heard all those details that Ramesh shared with us here live from the newsroom. What do you have to say of this entire scenario that's shaping up? Because now the exchange of reactions has already begun.
Well, we expect the Russians to react. They need to state their position and not roll to what the Western coalition has done. But when we listen to what is said, they are saying that the U.S. has acted incorrectly, made an error, not listened to the wise counsel and the cautions from the Russian government or the Syrians. And then that's about it. They have not said, not only is this unacceptable, but we will do something about it. In fact, their silence is what is telling. So I am starting to think what I and one of our colleagues, I think Daniel, said a few moments ago, that this will be a series of statements to put down a marker and to make a point. And then so long as Russians are not attacked and the regime is not threatened, then Russia's vital interests and Syria's have not fundamentally been affected. And I don't think Russia will do too much more after that.
Right. Also, you were talking about, the possibility of an asymmetrical attack coming in from Russia. How would you expand on that?
I'm starting to think that is less likely given what we've been hearing over the last hour. But the way it would happen is, to America's great distress and chagrin, many times in the last decades, we have been confronted by opponents who are smart enough to realize that a front-on conflict with the United States is suicidal. So whether it's in Iraq or in Vietnam or in Afghanistan or elsewhere. So what they would do is, if there were guerrilla operations that one could conduct, one would do that. I don't expect that to be the case here in Syria. Or some other indirect kind of step that neutralizes effectively the United States' overwhelming conventional superiority.
Right. Mr. Kal, my colleague, Mr. Ramesh Ramachandran, would also like to take a question from you.
Thank you, Akanksha. Good morning, Glenn. If I may begin by asking you, for the benefit of viewers who might just be tuning in, talk us, if you will, about the legality of the latest targeted precision airstrikes conducted jointly by the US, UK and France. What do you reckon about the consequences of these actions as missile strikes, some foreseen and some possibly unforeseen? Glenn?
Well, I did work for years at the UN, but I'm not a lawyer, and I haven't read the statutes that are most directly relevant this evening.
Okay, let me rephrase my argument for you, Glenn. Is this... who has authorized these airstrikes? Now, we heard about Article 70 of the Constitution of the US, but does it gel with the world community at large? Does it come with the UN authorization or not?
Well, I think the rationalization will be, or the explanation will be, that the UN has passed resolutions, one concerning chemical weapons, and two concerning the Syrian civil war and the use of weapons like this on civilians or innocent or any individual, and that the three nations are acting to affirm the principles stated by the United Nations. The counter argument will be, of course, that the Security Council of the United Nations is the only international body that can authorize force except in self-defense by a nation, and that absent a vote of the Security Council, these steps are not authorized. They therefore are illegal. So we will hear both arguments.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Glenn Kal, for joining us live from Boston, Ramesh Ramachandran joining us live from the newsroom, and Daniele Pagani joining us from Amman. It's time to wrap this news edition, but we will continue to track this big story on WION today, which is US airstrikes in Syria. We'll continue to bring you the latest on this news story.